It was after the car accident that it all started for him, when John began to see the fabric of what we call reality begin to stretch and pop. That cold October morning after the night of rain. The feeling of the sudden lurch in gravity as his car collided with the guardrail on the highway. His head took most of the trauma from the collision, cracking into the side window and slamming into the concrete on the outside as the vehicle spun upside down. John's eyes shut tight as the skin of his eyelids were sliced by the cement and shards of glass. The blackness of his own mind suddenly teemed with red and pink as their soft body collided with the outside forces of the world. Most people would say that was all they could remember. They recall very little of what happened between an accident and waking up in the hospital. John could remember bits and pieces, rather. Now, some may call this an out-of-body experience, but John never felt as though he had left his body. He remembers jostles from the crash cart, the needles of life support fluid, and the various voices and forms around him. Then a kind of cool blackness like sleep that washed over him. In the blackness of sleep, he saw a small dot that grew larger and larger the more he stared at it, almost as if it were an opening he was moving closer to. John felt no pain, not even a sensation of movement, but visually, it was definitely getting closer. John peeked through the dot, rather than saw through it. Its form was not constant, but never grew much more beyond the size of a fist. Within the coolness, John felt heat radiating from the dot, like that of a lamp. He looked with one eye and then the other. Shadow-like blotches and blobs moved about while others stayed constant. It was like looking through a hole in a fence when your eyes had not yet adjusted to the light outside. Even after his eyes had focused some, the forms were still without definition or detail. Some jittered about like insects, while others appeared to waltz in elaborate dances across an infinite plain. John saw one form drawing nearer to where he was peeking. A long, spindle-like appendage reached toward him. The heat grew closer to him as it placed this appendage over his eyes. The darkness and sensation floated away, and a myriad of dreams danced before him for what seemed like an eternity. Awakening in the hospital bed, he was greeted by those that knew him. They all came rushing in, smiling faces and lit eyes, all ecstatic that he had pulled through this ordeal. The accident would have been minor had John not taken such an impact to the head. He could feel the bracing on his neck, and the various plates that replaced chunks of skull became known to him as he stirred awake. The real world had returned. The coolness was dying away as John felt the dull, warm pain of reality return to him. A few days more, maybe a week, and he found himself returning home. It was in those early morning hours at his home that he began to see them for the very first time. He was told by the doctor that his eyelids had been almost completely removed by the accident. Using skin from his back, they crafted new eyelids, and it would take a while to adjust to the new weight and thickness of him. His eyes drying out, seeing blotches, and restless nights were just some things John was told to expect. At first, the nights were restless, with most of his sleeping having to be done during the day. After a while, he began to slip back into a usual circadian rhythm. But little did he realize that he would soon come to relish the blackness of the night. No light to see them in. John awoke on his side that morning. His eyes adjusted to the pale green and blue aura created by the trees outside and the dull October sky in the early morning. Slowly rising up into a sitting position, feeling the coolness of the blankets on his feet. He saw what looked like an insect on the far wall. At first, he dismissed it, merely as a spider or a large fly, but as his mind settled from sleep, he began to realize it was far too large to be merely an insect. It was definitely insect-like, with its black body, long antenna, and multiple ligaments. It moved across the wall in a zigzag pattern, as if searching for an exit that wasn't there anymore. As John adjusted further to what he was seeing, he began to put together the pieces of what it was he was looking at. The body, while mostly black, was rough and coiled round itself like a twisted piece of chain. The head, which remained mostly still despite the rapid movements of its limbs, was actually a dull red on what appeared to be some sort of fabric or silk. The long tendrils that made up its appendages were striped with white, like that of a mosquito's. The tips of them, however, were expanded upon further with small X's to grip the wall. As it moved from side to side, John felt a fear begin to grow in his throat. He knew in his heart that he wasn't supposed to be seeing what he was indeed seeing. Everything about this creature was unnatural, and the more John stared, the more he was sickened by its appearance. John crawled to the end of the bed, and with each inch closer saw the vile complexities of this thing. It was as if a sick experiment had given life to a creature that deserved none. As his feet hung over the edge of the bed, as if sensing it was being observed, the insect thing darted behind the dresser mirror, and it did not come out the other side. Drawing near to the mirror, John knew it was still there. Behind the wood and glass was this black and twitching mass of limbs and feelers. He knew it was there. He knew it was waiting for him. Waiting for John to look into the shadows. Waiting to spring forward in a mad dash and knock him to the floor. As John gathered his courage, he prepared his hand in a raised position. If it ran, it wouldn't get far, John told himself. With a final exhale, he looked behind the mirror. Nothing. No shape, no shadow, not even noise of its scurrying. It was gone. Vanished. He went back to the edge of the bed and sat rallying his thoughts over what had happened in the last few moments. In the days that followed, John couldn't shake the memory of that thing on the wall. Its crooked and onyx form sneaking from point to point on the wall. The unnatural shape of it. The feeling of dread it planted in him that early morning. The feeling that it was still there in the dark waiting as he slept. The sudden jolt from sleep, as if it were right at his bedside, now large and looming, its mouth revealed from the red silk. Out of its sickening black maw came the shadows of 1,000 damned souls reaching out for John as he slumbered, only to be driven off at the last moment as he quaked from sleep to awake. The nightmares were becoming more vivid, more almost demanding to exist, night after night. John found himself lying awake much like he did as a child, afraid to sleep at the horrors that awaited if he dared close his eyes for even a moment. Each day, the world began to look more and more frightening to him. Mornings were met with that sickening green from the light outside. Everything that was lit by bulbs took on a putrid yellow hue. Worse still, John felt as if he was still being watched, not just by the thing, but rather by things beyond that, which he had seen that morning. John recalled picking up a book on the nightstand and opening it to find the letters wriggling and writhing on the paper like worms. In shock, he threw it against the wall where it hit with a wetting splat and sank to the floor, soaking wet with blood and ink. He wrapped himself in the comforter. He told himself that he didn't see that. That didn't happen. That he was not losing his mind. He did not see the letters moving like ants. He could not feel them between his fingers. There was not a bleeding book on the other side of the room. After that incident, he did his best not to leave his bed for as long as possible. He forced himself to sleep. The odd dreams and feverish sprints into his deepening mind were welcome compared to what awaited him beyond his fabric womb. His body cried and ached to move, to walk, to leave, but his mind stopped it, told it that it didn't know how, that it didn't want to, or it would die, that it would melt upon touching the floor, that there was only safety and serenity in his bed. Waking tonight, waking today, waking to midday, evening, sundown, sunup, rain, wind, clouds, and then a stillness. John pulled back the covers to see the world as he knew it now, stretching into infinity under a red and orange sky of clouds and specters. The bed was now a molding, wet gelatin like a pool that John had to pull himself free from. As he did, he felt his skin wrench from his body, his exposed muscles breathing in the cool air of this plane of madness and dreams, leaving a trail behind of sticky black footprints. He wandered into the infinity of the world. Coming to a vast canyon, pillar-like islands lit with piers atop them. Around them, figures huddled for warmth, their long, dark fingers covering their heads. They fear everything. They fear the others sitting around their piers and their fears. John knew their pain. They cry out for salvation into an empty void of nothingness. They huddled closer to the fires. They shudder at the wind and make their circles tighter. John passed buildings that towered above, meldings of brick and mortar and flesh and bone, abandoned husks of places that man once took such pride in, objects that mocked the natural world and its beauty, shrines to the self now rotting under the countless suns of this damned place. The sickening smells and dripping corridors offer no shelter, no safety. Within, figures lurk and hulk about. They are blind and ravaging for any contact. They are skinny figures of bone and flesh. They reach out and scream whenever they collide with a wall or obstacle. Some claw at the floors of muck, their nails green and black with soot popping off like plastic wrappings as they madly search for some remnant of what once was, what they once knew, what they once valued so dearly. John took shelter in these putrid halls for fear of what floated in the sky. Out of the clouds and mist appeared faces, haunted roaming visages that stared down upon him with an undying gaze. There were so many of them. The ones of obvious age were decomposing like trees, their skin and flesh inching away with mold and scattering lines of sinew. Many had no eyes in this state, empty black chasms that still cast their unspoken feelings of doubt and frustration upon him. No matter how frightening these were, though, it was the faces of the children that terrified him the most. The large eyes, the knowing smiles that grew as they spotted him from a distance. John was a plaything to them, an insect in their world, on their wall. He had never known fear like that of these children looming over him. Heads, and nothing more. John spent days in one of the rotting tombs before madness gripped him to shout out into the darkness. The wandering searchers turned towards him and swarmed like flies. Some crawling and others sprinting, some clung to walls, while others lurched from shadows unseen. He felt their cold and bony hands upon his rotting flesh, the flesh which he had let simmer in that stinking pond for days. They grappled and tore at his heels. He was new flesh. He had memories of the other world, of the other side of the mirror, of the world that they now searched for. Crashing through a window of unnatural design, John found himself running across the plain. The children's heads, now numerous, twisted themselves into howling torrents, alerting the rest of the dimension of his existence. He had seen their world. He had come too close to what they knew, what they kept secret from all of us, that they were damned, that they surround us. They live in the shadows of our world, and they breed our fear. They watch and yearn for what we have, life, lives that they wasted and tainted with sin. Now they watch the world rot around them. John saw all this now and understood the crimes that he had committed. He had viewed them, seen the secret world, and knew too much. His legs took him far into the nether, into the cascade of nightmares that lay in eternal directions. The hands and appendages reached out for him, clawing, wanting life, memory, sight, the sight lost that day in the rain that saw their world. It was special to them. It had seen both. John felt the ground grow wet beneath him, padding in puddles of slime and muck. The envious drool of the floating heads above him burned his skin and melted his flesh. The fear inside built, the fear of it all, the undying madness that haunted him since that day in the bedroom. The lump of terror from that thing on the wall finally poured forth from his lungs in a twisted scream that shattered his entire being. His jaw snapped, his fingers broke, brain bubbling, eyes boiled, intestines rupture, reaching out his veins popped, reaching for salvation and finding nothing. "Another whack job, probably out of his mind on meth," said one officer. "Without a doubt. Had an accident a few days ago. Got too pumped up with painkillers and bang. Right into traffic," said another. He had left his home that morning screaming, running scared from one thing or another. He complained of nightmares, of insects, of reality. He caused a 4-car pileup at a local intersection. Only one survivor. They say she took most of the force to her head, but they say that she'll live. She'll be all right. She'll soon have her sight back. She'll soon see what John saw. She'll soon join him and the others. She'll soon be part of the other world. The world of the damned.